Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be starting a new unit called Thinking or Cognition and Language, looking at the ways that we think and the obstacles that we have in problem solving, and also language, how language develops and how language dictates what we think. So let's go ahead and get started. What exactly is cognition? Cognition is the mental activity that we use to process, store, and understand information. It's the way that we think both logically and illogically, and it's what we use to solve problems. If you recall from previous units, we build our understanding of our world throughout our experiences in our lifetime, creating schemas and categories for different objects or ideas that we're presented with. We also create what are known as concepts. And concepts are the mental groupings of similar objects or events or people, right? So if you were to think of a car, for example, you'd be able to recognize or identify a car based on its common components, that it has 4 wheels and a steering wheel, it has seats, and so on. Obviously, different cars are going to look different, but the idea of a car we can identify because we have a concept for what it is. Now, this is different than a schema because a schema uses context. So if we are filling in a gap of our memory of what kind of car we saw parked on our street this morning, we might use the context of what most of our neighbors' cars look like to fill in that gap of what the car most likely looked like that was parked on your street. But a car in general, our ability to identify it is based on a concept. If we're talking about a specific type of car, then we are talking about a prototype. And so a prototype is our best example for a category or concept. So if I say, think of a car, whatever brand of car or type of car that pops up in your head, that would be your prototype, your best example for a car. And everybody's prototype could be different, but they all fit into that concept of what a car is. So prototypes help us to understand the world and solve problems quickly. They become our shortcuts for making sure that we can make sense of the world around us. And shortcuts help us to solve problems by using past experiences, our best examples, seeing how they match up with what's happening to us now in that process that we call top-down processing from sensation and perception. Another type of shortcut we use are heuristics. And heuristics are those rule of thumbs that we use to help us quickly solve problems. There are different types of heuristics that we want to be familiar with because they fit into this concept of prototypes and shortcuts that we use to solve problems quickly. One type of heuristic is called the representativeness heuristic. And this is where we use those prototypes to make decisions. It's kind of like a stereotype in a sense, because we are judging things based on how well they represent our prototype. And oftentimes, if we're talking about, say, people, our prototype might actually be a stereotype. So if we were to see someone walking down the street with a tweed jacket on and glasses, we might assume that they are a professor or a librarian or some type of academic career-related job because that image matches our prototype that we have in our minds for what does a professor or what does a librarian or what does an academic look like. So you can see how it's a rule of thumb, a shortcut that might not actually be accurate, but we're using information to try and quickly solve problems here. The availability heuristic is where we base the likelihood of events based on how well we remember them. So this is about how quickly things come to our mind. The idea here is that the faster something comes to our mind, the more likely we actually expect it to occur. So if you hear about a lot of pickpocketing when people go to visit Europe, you might assume that it happens more often than it actually does. And if you were to ask someone, what's the greatest risk in visiting a city like Paris, you might say, oh, pickpocketing, even if that isn't the highest rated crime in that city. Because you hear about it so often, you assume it happens more often than it actually does. So that's what the availability heuristic is. It might also explain why people are more afraid of crashing in a plane than in a car, because those events stick out in their mind and they're readily available, not because they happen so often, but because when you do hear about them, you hear about them a lot. And they become availability heuristics when thinking about accidents we should be afraid of. And an anchoring heuristic is another type of shortcut we use, oftentimes when looking at numbers and trying to make an estimation about an event or an outcome. For example, how much money does Britney Spears have? If you're given an original value, so the question being, does Britney Spears have more or less than $20 million? That is going to anchor our guess of how much money Britney Spears actually has. If you think it's higher, how much higher? Do you think she has $25, $30 million? You might be surprised then to find out that she has almost triple that, because that first original number anchored our guesses so much lower than they actually would be. So anchoring heuristic is where we use some type of value to pull down or up a guess of how much something is actually worth, or how much of something there actually is. A more reliable type of problem solving is known as an algorithm. And algorithms are step-by-step processes that we use that are going to guarantee results. They're not as fast as heuristics, and that's why we often use those rule of thumb, but they're more likely to guarantee a correct answer. It's kind of like trying to open up a door when you have a set of keys on a key ring. You have to go through each and every single one until you find the one that opens that door. By just randomly trying different ones, or trying ones that look like they match the color of the doorknob or the handle, you might be correct, but testing each one is the only thing that's actually going to guarantee a correct result. So that would be that difference between using a heuristic or an algorithm. Other types of problem solving we might experience is insight problem solving, where you don't use an algorithm or a heuristic, but sometimes the answer just comes to us. Sometimes you can think about it in things like anagrams, where you just stare at it for a couple seconds and then, aha, the answer just comes to you. That would be an example of insight problem solving. We can also use deductive and inductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is when we go from broad to specific, taking generalizations and then applying it to specific examples. Syllogisms are a great example of how we could use deductive reasoning. If we take two true statements, such as all men are mortal and Harold is a man, we can reasonably conclude then that Harold is mortal. That would be an example of deductive reasoning, because we start with this broad idea that all men are mortal, and we can apply it to Harold specifically, and it leads to a valid conclusion. Inductive reasoning doesn't necessarily lead to valid conclusions. This is where we take specific cases and then we generalize it to the broader scope of our study. An example of this would say pulling a penny out of a bag and saying, I pulled a penny from the bag, so I can conclude that all the coins in the bag are pennies. So you can see that may or may not actually be true. We're taking one instance and trying to apply it to the broader population. So there are some obstacles in problem solving that we can experience as well. Different things that prevent us from thinking clearly or coming up with solutions to problems that we face. Other examples of these obstacles to cognition include functional fixedness, where we fail to see alternate uses for familiar objects. Say you need to screw in a screw and you don't have a screwdriver, but you don't think of using a penny or a dime that fits into that slot nicely. That inability to see a coin being used for anything other than using it to buy things is functional fixedness. We can also fall trap to what's known as a mental set, and that is when we just continue to do things the way they've done before because they've worked in the past. So perhaps you're playing a video game and it's not working, and you bang on the top of the console and it works. So the next time it's no longer working again, that's what you do because it worked in the past, and it may or may not be successful this time. So a mental set is using problem-solving strategies that we've used before. Confirmation bias is when we look for information that's going to confirm or reinforce our already existing beliefs. We see this happen all the time, particularly in politics. If there is a candidate or a viewpoint that we already agree with, we're going to look for information that's going to reinforce that belief. And we can see confirmation bias and group polarization from social psych really go hand in hand, because it's only going to strengthen our belief as we look for information and talk to other people who hold the same beliefs that we do. Belief bias is a little different, because this is where someone has a belief that distorts their logical thinking. This time, a person might not be seeking out information to support their side, they just believe it. So if I have a belief about someone, whether or not I've actually looked up that information to know if it's true or not, that pre-existing belief is a belief bias. Now, if someone were to present contrary information to me about this person, I would try to distort that evidence, try to change that evidence to say that it is not valid, that it is fake news, that it is whatever it might be, to hold on to my belief. And if I'm holding on to my belief, even in the face of contrary evidence, that is known as belief perseverance. So belief perseverance is when we're faced with contrary evidence. If, say, my favorite celebrity commits a crime and the evidence is overwhelming, and I just maintain the fact that they didn't do it, that is belief perseverance. Even when I know I'm wrong, I hold on to that belief. It's something that we can fall victim to, and it's an obstacle to our cognitive process. And then finally, the other ways that we fall victim to these obstacles of cognition: overconfidence. We tend to think we know more than we actually do. We learned about that in our research unit, that and hindsight bias. And the way that information is framed, kind of like wording effects, is also going to affect our thinking process. So if we're shopping for, say, a coat, we might see that that coat is $100, or we might see that same coat on sale at $150 for 33% off. At the end of the day, it's worth the same, but those words of on sale might predispose us to select that coat thinking that we're getting a better deal out of it. So framing the way that information is presented to us can change the way that we think about it. That's where we're going to go ahead and stop for today. And in our next video, we'll talk about language, how it forms, and how it dictates the way that we think. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, be kind to your mind.